So, our speaker today, Jonathan Semple. I know him as the current de facto president of the Undergraduate Game Dev Club. He's a longtime executive alongside Brooke and Ryan. Graduated from CS 2015. Yep. He's been working with Exonify, currently working on a bunch of his own game prototypes, and I'm particularly intrigued by what he does because he focuses on sort of role-playing games that have atypical mechanics, lots of focus on psychology and interpersonal dynamics, and less so on the trappings of dice and character sheets and all that whatnot. So today he'll be talking to us about role-playing as terrible people in The Crows of Autumn.
All right, cool. So yeah, hopefully this isn't a disaster. As John said, I'll be talking about role-playing as terrible people in The Crows of Autumn. And I mean, he kind of already introduced me, but the slides here, so it's happening. First off, who am I? Since I know some of you more than others. I'm Jonathan Semple, not a student anymore. As John said, I graduated from computer science last year. But I came into contact with the GI through my involvement with the Undergraduate Game Dev Club. And the GI has allowed me to use some of their space to work on some of my own personal projects, a lot of which of late revolve around tabletop role-playing games. For example, The Crows of Autumn. I'm more of an aspiring designer than anyone established. If you dig around, you might find something I've done online from a jam or something. But I don't have any sort of like actual proper proven credentials or anything like that. So sort of keep that perspective in mind. This is just some thoughts and motivations and ideas I've had in working on one of the projects I'm currently working on. Maybe you'll find it interesting or whatever. Hopefully you'll get something out of it. If nothing else, it will give you an idea of what I'm working on when I'm back there in the desk I sit at. So, what is The Crows of Autumn? It's a tabletop role-playing game. It's meant to be for more long-form play, which would just mean you play over multiple sessions and sort of develop a story over a longer period of time. It can work well for sort of short-form, one-off type things. In longer play, it tends to be fairly serialized between individual sessions, but there are some mechanics and aspects of the design that really only come into play over a longer period. I ran the very first playtest of The Crows of Autumn maybe 2.5 years ago. It was just a single session then. It was a pretty rough first draft of the rules with just made from a very basic idea of the setting and some of the themes. I didn't really have a full idea of what it would be in terms of would it be sort of a smaller, shorter, lightweight kind of game or something a bit heavier for longer play with a bit more depth, which is sort of what it's ended up becoming. So mechanically, The Crows of Autumn is powered by the apocalypse. What this means is it's based on another indie role-playing game called Apocalypse World by a fellow named Vincent Baker. It's a pretty cool game. Maybe you should check it out. So Crows of Autumn is a hack of Apocalypse World, which is sort of the common terminology they use for that, and something that the creator, Vincent Baker, encourages people sort of taking the core underlying ideas and mechanics of the game and sort of making something new with it with their own ideas and their own themes and settings. So Apocalypse World does a bunch of interesting things. I'm a bit of a fan of it, which is why I'm hacking it. And some of the interesting things it does includes encouraging a more improvisational style of GMing that brings the players and the characters into a more prominent role in creating the narrative. It has a focus on the fiction and the flavor of the setting, and it emphasizes the idea of role-playing as a conversation. So what really interests me about role-playing games in general is the sort of idea of them as just collaborative storytelling games. You sit down with your friends and you tell a story together. And so Apocalypse World, and by extension The Crows of Autumn, with what it borrows from Apocalypse World, emphasizes the conversational aspect of this. Both games adopt the sort of traditional style of having a game master and the players, where the game master kind of runs the world and players control their individual characters. And to play Apocalypse World and its derivatives, you simply just sit down and you have a conversation where the players say what their characters are doing at any given time, and the GM says what everyone else in the world does. And that's it. That's how you play. Occasionally, the game will indicate what sort of thing you should say next through its mechanics. And sort of that kind of emphasizes the conversational nature here a bit more than in other games, where most of the player-facing mechanics are encompassed in a set of what the game calls moves. Where a move is just a discrete chunk of rules and mechanics with a specific trigger, usually a trigger grounded in the fiction of the game, and which comes into play as a result of the fiction you're creating. So you're having this conversation every so often when the player says something that corresponds to a move, and then you follow that move, and it kind of dictates maybe what you should say next. And so the moves very much just mediate the conversation. And as a game designer, to me, this kind of offers a nice, concise way of saying what sort of situations the game is interested in, and what sort of things you should say when you encounter those situations. And the game ends up being pushed more into the role of facilitating a story rather than trying to simulate anything or necessarily telling its own story or letting someone tell their story. You have an idea of a story, but the game kind of guides it around along certain themes and brings all the players in on it and on the conversation. And one more thing that the moves do is rather than have a simple success and failure kind of result that a lot of role-playing games do when you roll dice or there's chance involved or whatever, Apocalypse World does what it calls misses, weak hits, and strong hits, where a miss means things get worse, a strong hit means you get what you want, and a weak hit, which is generally the most likely result, means you get what you want but with complications. And this means the mechanics here favor the player characters progressing towards their goals, but in a way that introduces new problems to deal with, creating sort of a snowball of conflicts and interesting situations. And importantly, on a miss, the general rule is things get worse rather than nothing happening. So it creates a situation where, regardless of what happens, the narrative doesn't stall out. It keeps things moving forward. So the Crows of Autumn takes a bunch of these core concepts, such as the idea and structure of the moves, as not so much necessarily the specific moves of Apocalypse World itself. And it takes some of the other mechanics that are a bit less core, such as it uses the same dice, it uses the same sort of harm rules for measuring how people get hurt, which are things that other hacks have kind of played with changing. And it takes that and it sort of builds its own flavor and themes and saying on top of all of that. As for what that setting is, the Crows of Autumn is what I refer to as sort of a pseudo-historical dark fantasy. It's set in a fictional 17th century Europe, or a pastiche thereof. I don't know if that's even the right use of the word pastiche, but it's a saying that evokes 17th century Europe, even if it's not necessarily 17th century Europe. If you don't want your game strictly grounded in the real world, you don't have to. The game is less interested about exploring the 17th century Europe, more as using it as a backdrop for some of its own themes. The Crows of Autumn provides a sort of basic concept and aspects of a setting, but tries to leave some blanks for you to fill in as you play. So it's roughly 17th century Europe, and in this setting, magic is real. There's a plague going on, and there's the spooky, mysterious, potentially supernatural plague doctors wandering about. There's these things called revenants, which are creepy specters in some way connected with death. And the player characters are agents, known as the Chosen, of an organization called the Hand of Faith and Justice. So the Hand operates above the law and it hunts down evil and heresy. And it has rather questionable methods and morals. It has vague shades of the Inquisition. The motto of the Hand is Timore contra Timore, which may be terrible Latin grammar. If anyone knows Latin, you can correct me on that. But when you plug it into Google Translate, it gives me roughly the results I want, which is fear against fear. So in part, as per the title of this presentation, the Crows of Autumn is an exercise in having the players play as terrible people. People who do horrific things, but importantly are told and convinced that their duty is good and just, and where they serve an organization that tries to keep order through fear, that's maybe a bit too reliant on lethal force, and where in the course of their duties, they'll be asked to do things such as torture. So torture is an aspect of the Crows of Autumn. It's maybe a slightly heavy topic or something, but it's one that features in the game, and I'm reasonably happy with how I have the game portraying it. So in the Crows of Autumn, torture works in a fairly specific way. As a game powered by the Apocalypse, torture is represented mechanically in a move. So in the Crows of Autumn, as an Apocalypse world, there's two general types of moves. There's basic moves, which all characters have access to and which are always in play. And then there's special character-specific moves that only certain characters will have and sort of imply some special skill or training or ability. But in Crows of Autumn, torture is a basic ability. This is something that all chosen, all player characters are trained in and know how to do. And all the rules about torture are just encompassed here in this one move about it. So, to break it down, first we see the trigger. It says, when you torture a person, it requires time and intimacy. So that parenthetical, requires time and intimacy, is just an indication of what torture entails. It takes extended time, and it's private and personal. If you're interrogating someone, you just grab their hand and put a knife through it, that's a dick move, but it's not torture. And if they're fighting you, if there's interruptions, you're not really going to have much luck with that either. Now, tying someone down to a rack, slowly stretching them, that's torture. Placing heavier and heavier weights on someone's chest, slowly crushing them, that's torture. Pouring water over a face-covering cloth to simulate suffocation and drowning, that's torture. It's a slower, more intimate process. Now, the trigger itself is simply when the move kicks in and enters the game's conversation. So simple here is just as when you torture a person, but importantly, the rule for the way the moves work is for a move to come into play, your character must be doing something in the fiction that fits the move. You could leave it kind of vague and just be like, well, I drag them off to the dungeon for questioning, where everyone knows what questioning means in this context. But if you simply say, yeah, I torture them, the GM's going to say, cool, what do you do? And so with something like torture, this has the benefit that the players must kind of acknowledge it. They must firmly establish what their character's actions are in the fiction. And so they establish that the character's not just doing some vague, nebulous game mechanic, but that, yes, their character's actually torturing someone, actually going through with this. As one of my playtesters once pointed out, context is sort of key with this. Without context and a void, it could end up being just like, ah ha ha, I poke your eyes out, ah ha ha, and be a bit more of a silly thing. Whereas here, there's a few ways the move provides context. First, there's that fictional grounding of the move, but there's also the context of the move existing within the game it exists in, which is a longer form role-playing game where the players will continue playing these characters and hopefully become invested in them. And so they might need to come to terms with what sort of person their character is, or figure out how the character might reconcile themselves with the things that has to do on behalf of the hand. And as a longer form game, the larger plot lines and politics that might be part of the story will also create additional background circumstances to the situation. So looking at the next part of the move, we get into what I sort of mean when I say the torture here works in a specific way, where before anything else, once you've established in the fiction that you're torturing someone, before you even pick up the dice to roll them, you state what their confession is. And this is not something abstract like the truth. This is something concrete like, I'm a witch. Because the next thing that happens is, well, the player picks up some dice and rolls them, which here it's just two six-sided dice. You add them together. You add what the game tells you, in this case, cruel, which is the stat, which in part measures a character's aptitude with inflicting pain. And then on a hit, which is a 7 or higher, they confess exactly as you said it, as in word for word, which is why something like the truth doesn't work, right? They say, yes, I'm a witch. Their confession as you said it. And this sort of plays into the idea that you can get someone to say whatever you want under torture. Now on a miss, which is a 6 or less, it says, you've broken them with no confession. So you don't fail to torture them. No, you tortured them. It happened. But when you look at sort of this miss result in relation to what happens on a hit, it creates some implications about how the chosen operate. They torture until they get the confession that they want, or until the subject is no longer capable of giving any sort of confession. And so the whole idea here is that with the rest of the move, you don't necessarily know the truth when you hear it, right? You're torturing someone and you want them to say they're a witch and they say, no, I'm not a witch. Well, maybe it's true, or maybe you just haven't tortured them enough. So you keep going and eventually either they say, yes, I'm a witch, to make it stop, or you reduce them to a useless husk of a human being. So all these things sort of play on that potential unreliability of a confession made under torture, right? People say whatever they need to get you to stop. But with just that, the player wouldn't really get anything out of the mechanic, except maybe in sort of an in-character justification of burning someone at the stake or something. Justification in quotes there, because fuck that. So the part of the intent, though, is to actually encourage the players to do this and sort of fall into the role of someone who uses torture, which is where the rest of the move comes into play, where on a hit, after they confess, you get to ask some questions, 2 on a strong hit, 1 on a weak hit. And these are sort of out-of-character questions about things your character might have learned or intuited while they were torturing the person. And the first question you can ask is their confession false? The next 2 questions ask, what do they really know about blank, fill in the blank, or what did they really do blank? And these 2 questions actually have the potential to get some concrete information for the players to act on. But neither will necessarily answer whether the confession is false or not. And it's actually quite intentional that the question, is the confession false, is at the top of the list. It's the first thing the players see, and so it helps reinforce that idea immediately that false confessions might be of a concern. You're forcing someone to say something. And in being first, in some ways, it sort of sets itself as the default or maybe a bit more prominent than the others. And even if the player doesn't ask it, they might be thinking they should. So in some ways, it's also there as sort of a question of conscience. If you want to get rid of the, if you want to get that certainty of, did I get the right person? Are they evil? You can do that, but at the same time, in that case, you might be a bit scared of the converse. Because if they're innocent, if it turns out their confession is false and you know that, well, then you know you just torture an innocent person. And torture is not something they're going to recover from. There's also a few other factors at play that sort of drive the players towards torture beyond just the mechanic and the move itself. Primarily, in the game, torture is pretty much the only way to force someone to tell you something they don't want to. There's a move for interrogating a person, but all it does is give you a few chances to ask the GM, are they lying or not? Or are they hiding something, leaving something out? And if they are lying, well, you might call them out on it. Maybe you'll threaten them and maybe self-preservation will take over. But there's no mechanical weight behind that, and there's no way outside of torture to force them to fess up and tell you what they're hiding if they really don't want to. And so that's torture, and that's the way it works, and a few of the ways it kind of tries to encourage the players to actually interact with this part of the game. Now, some other aspects of the game. Whoops, I just lost my notes. All right, we're good. So another aspect of the Crows of Autumn is the politics of the hand itself, the organization you're working for, which is something I've expanded on a bit since I first started making the game, since the very beginnings. And so here's what is said about the hand on the current character playbooks and under the instructions for creating your character. It says, the hand answers to the state, the hand answers to the church, the hand operates above the law to hunt down evil and heresy wherever it is found. Magic is evil and heretical, and the hand uses magic to combat evil and heresy. So, as you may have noticed, there's a few sort of ingrained contradictions and conflicts within the basic operation of the hand itself. And this creates sort of an internal mess of differing ideologies and politics within the hand that the players will have to navigate throughout the careers of their characters. There's also the idea that within the hand there isn't necessarily any sense of strict ranks. And there's a sense of seniority and experience where respected chosen have more political power and have more influence over the operations of the organization, which results in sort of a rank-like hierarchy forming. But it's one where the position of the player characters within the hierarchy can be a bit more fluid as they gain and lose influence. And so through gaining titles, which is the game's version of sort of improvements, developing your character in a mechanical sense, which narratively represent reputations and achievements and result in increased influence, but also through gaining and losing benefactors and detractors, which are just things or people within the hand that speak for or against your reputation. The characters will their position within this hierarchy will fluctuate. So there's a move that plays into all this. I won't go into details, but the trigger for it is when you pull a sway in the hand, you roll plus influence, which represents the idea that some things you want might occasionally need you to pull a few strings to get. And in the first few drafts of the game, this was the limit of the mechanical representation of the politics, just the influence in this one move that used it. What resulted from this, and the way the influence worked, was a situation where early in the characters' careers, players would largely kind of stay out the politics. So they didn't have much influence, so there's no point getting caught up in it. Better to avoid that than have bad things dumped on you as a result of failing to pull strings well. And they just sort of would accept what was given to the characters and kind of go along with the investigations they're told to follow. But as things progressed, once they started gaining some influence and could actually reliably pull a bit of sway, they got a bit more involved in the politics, and if the players wanted, they could sort of start maneuvering their characters into a position of higher authority. Or instead of following orders, they'd be directing others. And they'd have the potential to shift the focus of the game as the narrative grew. And so, as a result of that, I added a first addition to the political mechanics. And I had a move whose trigger just says, when you make promises on behalf of the hand. So this was to represent the idea that a character could end up in a position where they might be representing or speaking on behalf of the entire organization. And the move itself is less about dealing with the others, whatever other political entities you're talking to, and more about then having to go back to the hand and make good upon what you said without pissing anyone off in your organization. And so this does, however, bring in a bit of outside politics, despite the move itself not, the results of the move itself not dealing with the outside politics. It brings in the idea and lets you interact with them. And it sort of plays on the idea that there are other political bodies that the hand, this organization you work for and potentially have a lot of influence in, will have to deal with. After all, the funding has to come from somewhere. And they only really have authority because someone said they do. So this is an aspect of the politics which could trickle back to other areas of operation, such as the example of torture. If you torture someone with important friends, it could cause trouble for the hand. It could result in additional consequences and complications for you. Another aspect I added to the mechanics was the idea of access. With the initial political mechanics of pulling sway, there's no real sense of reaching a point where you'd just be able to be trusted with something. So be able to get something without having to pull strings around it. So actually this is simply a way to sort of mechanically represent things that a character can just acquire or affect without having to pull strings due to their position or responsibilities within the hand. They might be in a position where, say, they can direct where manpower is allocated. Or maybe they're trusty enough to just get whatever sort of extra equipment they'll need on a job. And then they're just able to do it without any roles or whatever, just due to the role they've ended up filling within the organization. And this is mostly a way to just mechanically represent something that was already sort of happening within the game. Players getting themselves into positions where they could start dictating aspects of how the hand operated. However, access, of course, can be lost in the game, and just because you can do something without anyone saying in your way doesn't mean that abusing your post won't provoke others. And one last small mechanic I added relating to the politics of the hand is perhaps one of the favorite additions I've added since I started working on the game, which is simply a move that says, when you meet another chosen, you can ask a question about them from a list, which in part is intended to represent the idea that overall the hand, or at least whatever branch of the hand the players are part of, is not necessarily all that large an organization. Even if you don't personally know all the other chosen well, you probably know at least something about them. And so the move doesn't require any sort of role, unlike the torture move or the other political moves. You just always get to ask one thing. You always know something about the other members of the hand. And for the players, this offers a better view of the political landscape they're trying to navigate. However, the bit I really like about it is how the move affects the GM, the game master. Because now, as soon as you introduce a non-player character within the hand, the players can ask for more details about them, which requires the GM to sort of stop and think and take a deeper look at the character and flesh them out a bit more in a way you wouldn't necessarily otherwise, which results in more developed NPCs and a larger quantity of them for the players to interact with, and a pool of these NPCs to be just drawn for future internal politics and conflict within the hand. The last bit I'll talk about is in regards to the Crows of Autumn is death. So even from the beginning, death was always intended to play a big part in the themes and narratives of the game, hence being set around a plague, hence the revenants, the spooky specters of death, hence the crow motif that runs throughout parts of the game, and it's why the game is called The Crows of Autumn. But when I first started developing the game, even with some of these themes in mind, I didn't fully expect how much a role death would play in just the individual narratives of the player characters themselves, sort of personal stories. So I added, this was in the game from the beginning, a mechanic called contract. I added this at the outset, and what it is it represents a literal contract between the chosen and death. And originally, it was in the game simply as a method to allow the players a bit more control about when their characters die. It would let a player say, oh, I'm not ready to stop playing this character yet, I want to see the story continue, so they don't actually die. The story doesn't end. And there's similar systems in other games, including Apocalypse World and many of its hacks. However, I flavored in this game this mechanic as a literal contract with death. And one where I decided the character doesn't actually avoid death, but they legitimately die, and then because of this contract, they're sent back. Death says, oh, you can continue your duty. I also made the decision to keep the specifics of this mechanic hidden from the players at the start of the game, unless they already know, like you guys do now, and only reveal that mechanic until it became relevant, which carries implications that if the players don't know about it, neither do their characters, implying that this contract was made without their knowledge. And when it does come into play, I generally sort of play with the idea that the characters don't really remember what happened. They don't remember actually dying. They figure, oh, I somehow miraculously survived that. The details are hazy. They don't remember about the contract. But as time goes on, death may become more and more familiar to them. And in terms of getting killed, the Crows of Autumn borrows the basic way harm and getting hurt works from Apocalypse World. However, characters here tend to have less armor, since the Chosen aren't soldiers after all. And while non-player characters are generally very expendable, the Revenants are far more threatening and deadly foes. And the result, death isn't super uncommon. And so all these things, the characters dying and the fact that they can easily come back to it and that's tied into the narrative, resolves in death, and particularly the chosen's relation to death, playing a much bigger role in their sort of the character's personal story than I originally expected, in a way that I really quite like. And so that's why I have. Those are a few aspects of the Crows of Alm, the thing I'm working on that excites me, and a few of the ways it's developed, and some of the ways it surprised me, and some of my motivations behind certain mechanics, and the dance to help me forget about the crushing existential angst which is ever present. All right. So, any questions, comments, feedback, criticisms, interpretive dances?
So I'm curious, the order and the politics and the relationship between the people, like that's all very cool.
Yep.
How, if I'm a new player, how do I know my backstory? Is that given to me? Do I?
So there's a bit given to you in the character creation. The idea is when you create characters, you're generally rookies. You're sort of just through training. However, there's an implication that because you're chosen, you don't necessarily volunteer. You're usually taken from another walk of life. So you have some previous backstory that's kind of on you to establish or maybe leave vague. But it does offer a few prompts to have history with the other player character, some way you've connected through training or before you're chosen or whatever. So it gives you a bit of backstory and a bit of relationship to play on between the other characters. And then from there, it's sort of seeing where your career goes from the beginning.
And so then, quick follow-on question.
Yep.
If we're a bunch of new recruits, for example, we're sent on a mission by the Order, could you give an example of one of those set
Right.
missions?
I forgot that I was supposed to be repeating questions. The first question was, of course, what sort of backstory is provided for the players. And another question is, just complete some line. Yeah, an example mission in order. So it might be something like my recent play test. I sent them to a couple villages where there are rumors that there's some weird magic going on because sailors were hearing sounds, demonic sounds echoing across the water. So they're just left in this village after they've had a bit of experience, so they're kind of trusted off on their own and sort of figure out what's going on. Or sort of earlier it might be like, here's something that died under suspicious circumstances, something in a way where sort of the basic town militia or whatever not really deal with it. Maybe there's magic involved, so up to you to figure out what happened. Or, hey, we found this coven of witches, we need to bust it up. You guys aren't really important, so you'll just be muscle and you just go deal with it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, this is probably like a 3.5-part question.
Sure.
So apologies in advance.
I'm gonna take a drink of water in preparation. Right?
All right. So the major theme of your talk here is role playing as terrible people. Right?
Yep.
So the first question that comes to mind for me is through play testing, because this is a long gestating game. It sounds like lots of play testing is happening, right? Have you encountered situations where players become uncomfortable with the shitty people they are role playing?
I think it probably depends a large part on the group. I think mostly the people in my role-playing groups tend to be okay. And often we sort of take the perspective of, in a way laughing at the characters, not because they're funny, but it's like, oh God, I can't believe how, horrible this person is. I'm cutting off someone's figures just so they'll tell me where they got some books. And so, yeah, I suppose it depends how you approach it and how the players, or the mentality of the players.
The next questions become a little bit more speculative then.
Yep.
What would happen in a situation where one of the players becomes uncomfortable? Because that sounds like something that could happen. Right?
Yeah.
Like,
So
how would you be able to navigate that?
I guess I
Would it
keep-
be a game-breaking thing, or is there a way that you could reconcile player discomfort?
Right. So I keep forgetting to repeat the questions, but it's about player discomfort, and the second part about how I keep losing my train of thought when I have to repeat things, and how would that break the game, or what's in the game to kind of help that move forward. And I think that's largely, in general, role-playing games, sort of an aspect of being GM, like knowing or keeping an eye on what your players are comfortable with. There's nothing in the game to kind of alleviate that. I mean, I suppose you could focus on different aspects, but for the most part, the game is what it is. and it's possible it's just not the game for some people. And so I think to me, it's just sort of a matter of having the right group, and if you think some people in your group might be uncomfortable with it as a GM, just kind of paying attention to people's boundaries, and when you need to just saying like, okay, do you need to talk about it, or do you want to stop, or do you want to do something else, or stuff like that. Because maybe that the game's it's just not their sort of game. This isn't something they're comfortable with exploring. So because the game does explore it, and there's not really a way around that. Any other questions, comments, feedback, criticisms, moshing, riots? If you're going to riot, probably take it outside.
So did I get that right? Like the basic mechanism is torture?
That's not the basic mechanism. So the torture isn't the basic mechanism. It's just one of the things. There's a set of basic moves that kind of represent the capabilities of the Chosen and what they're trained to do and whatnot, which are sort of, there's a move for using lethal force so in a fight, or just using it to stop someone running, and they probably don't end up in a good state. There's some moves for interrogating someone or investigating for clues and stuff. There's some moves about using magic, because the Chosen are trained in some basic forms of magic, despite it being evil and heretical. And there's also sort of a slightly kind of catch-all move that's just kind of when you're acting under duress, if it feels like, it shouldn't be so easy for you to just get through, and it doesn't fit one of the other moves, then you do that. So torture it's not necessarily the focus of the game, it's just a thing the Chosen do. And so it's one of the basic mechanics, because it's a core part of the sort of the way the hand operates.
So
Yes.
How do you determine the game has finished or complete? Because in the beginning of the talk you mentioned that it can be a long, you design it in a way so that it can play like in a long duration of time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, so the question is, how do you decide when the game's complete? And so in terms of like a single session, the way the game works is typically as the GM you create sort of an investigation. And the way it's sort of, the game tells you to approach is you kind of create some initial hooks and a concept, and you just play to go from there. And as a GM, you just kind of push things towards a resolution, and in 4 hours or whatever your playing session is, maybe you reach that. As for the longer game, as you kind of go through the character's career, and also maybe you jump back and forward a bit, and you see more and more investigations, you see them rise in the ranks. The game doesn't necessarily provide a set turning point. It might end when everyone's contract runs out and all the Chosen just end up dead in the ditch, as Chosen tend to do. Or, you might just keep going to tell us like, that feels like a good resolution, we're going to stop there. And so it's kind of on the group and what they want from it, I suppose, or how long they want to go.
So it's up to the GM?
Yeah.
Or you roll a die,
little
if
bit.
it's a hit, that's the end of the game.
Yeah, you could do that. But yeah, generally, the way I play it is you just kind of, and this is the way I play a lot of role-playing games, we just kind of keep going until a point where it feels like, yeah, things are starting to wrap up, and then maybe a few sessions that's like, yeah, that feels like a good conclusion point, so we'll wrap it there. Any other questions? Comments? Thoughts? All right, cool. Well, thank you for listening and whatnot, and yeah.
Thank you.